In the high fields above Lake Geneva, on a late June morning that should have been warm, a young woman wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped from her cottage door. The air was sharp with damp and cold, unseasonably so, even in the Alps, where winters lingered into May. She paused at the edge of the meadow, looking out across the valley, where the grass had not yet greened, where frost lay hidden beneath dew on the blades. Her breath plumed like smoke as she turned back toward her home, a stone house with windows shuttered against more than just wind. Somewhere far to the east, beyond seas and mountains, an island in the East Indies still smouldered. Sumbawa had erupted months before, its thunder heard across oceans, its ash swallowed by storms that veiled the sun. In England, farmers scratched their ploughs into frozen soil where corn should have been planted. In New England, snow fell again in June, and harvests failed from Pennsylvania to Vermont. The sky above Europe had grown pale, pale as bone, and the light seemed thin, strained, like a canvas stretched too tight. In the town of Geneva, Mary Shelley sat by a candlelit desk, her hands resting on paper that would soon bear words about monsters born in shadow. Across the lake, Percy Bysshe Shelley read poetry aloud to friends who shivered under blankets despite summer's name. No one spoke of volcanoes or dust veils or climate shifts. They were too close to the truth not to feel it, even if they could not yet name it. This was not just a bad year, it was a winter that never ended, and it began with fire and silence from an island few had ever seen. In April of 1816, a year that would come to be known as the year without a summer, the world was still reeling from the long shadow of war. The Napoleonic Wars had fractured Europe into warring factions and shifting borders. Peace treaties were being drawn with cautious hands, yet tensions lingered in every capital. Across the Atlantic, the United States was beginning to stretch its boundaries westward, but the vastness of its frontier remained unsettled. Wooded highlands, uncharted rivers, and plains that seemed endless. In Europe's villages and farmlands, life moved on a seasonal rhythm shaped by centuries. Plough to harvest, sowing in spring, gathering in autumn. But beneath this quiet continuity, something had already begun to shift. The year began with an eruption so vast it altered the Earth's atmosphere. On the island of Sumbawa, part of what is now Indonesia, Mount Tambora erupted in April 1815, expelling ash and gas into the stratosphere at a scale not seen for centuries. The immediate blast was catastrophic. Entire villages were buried beneath pyroclastic flows, and tens of thousands perished in the eruption's direct path. But its consequences stretched far beyond Sumbawa's shores. The dust and sulfur compounds ejected by Tambora circled the globe like a veil, scattering sunlight and cooling climates from North America to China. In Europe, spring arrived late. Snow fell over Switzerland and northern France in June. Crops failed across the continent. Wheat rotted in damp fields. Potatoes froze under frost. The harvests of 1816 were nearly non-existent. In New England, farmers watched their corn wither beneath a persistent cold fog. Crops that should have ripened by midsummer remained stunted and brittle. With food shortages looming, bread prices soared, migration increased, and unrest stirred in the countryside. The world had not yet learned to connect climate disasters to volcanic activity. There was no global weather network to warn of changing patterns, yet the effects were undeniable, a convergence of natural disaster and human vulnerability that would ripple through politics, famine, and even imagination. The quiet rhythms of agrarian life had been shattered, and what followed would be shaped by the shadows left behind by an eruption in a remote island chain, forgotten by most, remembered only in frozen fields and desperate letters home. The evidence of that year lies scattered across continents, etched in ice, preserved in soil, recorded in letters and ledgers. At the heart is Mount Tambora's caldera itself, a vast collapsed volcano with a rim scarred by ash and lava flows. Excavations within its summit reveal layers of pyroclastic material, pumice, rock fragments and fine dust trapped beneath later deposits. Radiocarbon dating confirms that these layers date to the spring of 1815, aligning precisely with historical accounts of a catastrophic eruption. Volcanic ash found in ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica contains chemical signatures unique to Tambora's composition, sulfur isotopes and glass shards, unmistakably linking the global cooling to this single event. In Europe and North America, farmers' journals and diaries describe repeated frosts in June and July, with crops ruined under unseasonal snow. Agricultural records from England show failed wheat harvests. German vineyards report premature frost damage. These first-hand accounts, while personal and inconsistent in detail, converge across regions, forming a pattern that defies natural climate variability. Glacial ice cores provide the clearest scientific confirmation. A sharp spike in sulfate concentration beginning just after April 1815, peaking in late 1816, then declining. This atmospheric signal indicates a massive injection of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, enough to reflect sunlight and cool the planet. In Europe's mountain valleys, sediment cores from lakes show abrupt shifts in pollen composition and silt deposition, signs of sudden climate upheaval. Tree ring data from Scandinavia and North America reveal unusually narrow rings for 1816, indicating stunted growth due to cold stress. While all these sources are physical or written traces, their reliability varies. Ice cores and volcanic strata offer near absolute chronology and chemical precision. Farm journals capture immediate human experience, but can be subjective. Tree ring data is robust, but reflects only regional conditions. Together, however, they form a resilient web of evidence, not just proving Tambora's eruption caused the year without summer, but demonstrating how nature, once disturbed at its core, can reshape civilization in silence and shadow. In the high valleys of Switzerland, families woke each morning to frost on their window panes in June, and the fields remained bare, as if winter had never released its grip. The air was sharp, with cold even at noon, and children walked barefoot to school through snowdrifts that clung like shrouds. Farmers stood in their muddy fields, watching sprouts shrivel before they could rise, wheat stalks blackened overnight, barley turned to dust in the wind. The harvests of 1816 were not just poor, they were gone. Families who had once counted on 3 months' grain now ate boiled roots and bitter herbs, scraped from riverbanks. In rural England, cottagers gathered their meagre crops with trembling hands, each potato a small victory, each sheaf of oats barely enough to feed a family for a week. Bread was rationed in town halls, flour had become a currency as rare as gold. Women stood in lines outside bakeries that opened only once every few days, their children shivering under thin woolen coats made from scraps and old blankets. In New England, farmers who had tilled the same land for generations turned to stone walls and stony fields with growing desperation. The first frost came not in October, but in April. When it did, corn that should have been knee-high stood frozen at seedling height. Men sold their tools, some even their ploughs, to buy foodstuffs they could not afford, while others took to the roads as migratory labourers, wandering from farm to village with little more than a sack and hope. In the villages of northern Italy, families huddled in rooms where hearths burned low, fueled by whatever wood or dried straw remained. Children learned to count days by how many times their bellies growled each day. Some said it was not hunger alone that made them weep, but fear, the sense that nature had turned against them, and no prayer could summon rain or sun. This was not merely a season of cold, it was a slow unravelling. The rhythm of daily life cracked under frost and famine. Every meal became an act of calculation. Every step outside carried risk. People began to speak in hushed tones, not only of hunger, but of what might come next. For the first time in memory, they looked at each other, not as neighbours, but as survivors sharing a world that no longer kept its promises. The true gravity of 1816 lies in the collision between a planet's fury and the fragile systems humans have built upon it. How one cataclysmic event could unravel the quiet rhythms of life across continents, not through war or revolution, but through atmospheric silence and sudden cold. The eruption of Mount Tambora in April 1815 was not merely an explosion, it was a planetary breath held too long. For weeks afterward, the sky over Java turned red at dawn, ash fell like snow, and thunder rolled without rain. But its real power lay unseen, the vast plumes of sulfur dioxide that soared into the stratosphere, spreading across hemispheres as aerosols that reflected sunlight back into space. The result was not a single cold day, but an unbroken descent into winter's grip during seasons meant to warm. This was no ordinary seasonal shift. In Europe and North America, snow fell in June. Crops withered under frost. Harvests failed where they had once been predictable for generations. Fields lay barren, fields that fed towns and markets and the labourers who depended on them. With food prices spiralling, bread became a luxury even the poor could not afford, and famine shadows stretched across villages from the Alps to Vermont. In the face of such failure, societies did not respond with unity, but with dislocation. Peasants fled their lands in search of work or survival, turning into waves of migration that strained communities already fraying at the edges. Yet even more profound was what happened when people could no longer rely on nature's constancy. In places where weather had once been a quiet companion, it became an enemy. The inability to predict seasons eroded trust in institutions meant to bring order. Governments, religious authorities, agricultural traditions, all of which rested on the assumption that life would continue as before. When that certainty vanished, so too did the foundations of stability. It was not just hunger that spread across the world that year, but doubt, the kind that breeds unrest and uncertainty. In this way, Tambora's silence became a louder force than its roar. It revealed how delicate the balance between earth and civilization truly is, and in that fragility lies the enduring truth. What we call nature is not just an element of our lives, but the very ground on which they are built. The world did not shift overnight, but the changes in 1816 were unmistakable. Slow at first, then relentless. The cold persisted long past spring's expected arrival, and when it finally broke, the land had already begun to wither beneath a veil of silence. Harvests failed across Europe and North America, not from drought alone, but from frost that struck in June and again in August, each time extinguishing what little promise remained. In the Alps and New England, crops turned black overnight. Fields once bright with barley became desolate stretches of frozen earth. The absence of grain created a hunger that was not merely physical, but existential. families divided by lack, villages emptied as people wandered north in search of open ground or simply air that might feel warmer. This strain did not remain confined to the soil. In Germany and France, bread prices spiraled upward with such speed that they outpaced wages, sparking unrest among labourers who had long been living on thin margins. There were no major uprisings, but the mood was taut. Whispers of famine in taverns, letters filled with dread passed between farmers and tradesmen. In Switzerland, Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley, sheltering from storms that seemed to come from nowhere, found their imaginations shaped by the very atmosphere around them. A world locked in perpetual twilight became the stage for Frankenstein's creation. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the failure of wheat harvests prompted migration on an unprecedented scale, families leaving farms they had farmed for generations, seeking land that might still yield. The movement was not orderly. It was survival carried in worn trunks and broken wagons. In Vermont, settlers spoke of the year without a summer, as if naming it could give it some kind of form, or at least make its suffering more bearable. By late autumn, the skies began to clear, not by choice, but by nature's own slow recalibration. The ash that had darkened the world for so long was falling, settling into soil and sea. Yet what remained, beyond the memory of cold, was a transformation in how people understood their place within a world shaped less by tradition than by forces beyond comprehension. A volcano in an island half a globe away, whose silence could echo across continents, altering lives not through war or conquest, but through the quiet collapse of seasons. The full scope of Tambora's global impact remains entangled in uncertainty, shaped as much by gaps in record-keeping as by the complexity of climate systems. While we know that 1816 was unusually cold across much of the Northern Hemisphere, precise temperature anomalies are inferred from scattered weather diaries and agricultural logs, records that vary widely in reliability and regional focus. The idea that snow fell in June across New England is well documented in letters and journals, but it does not imply a uniform freeze across entire continents. Localized cold snaps were more likely than widespread winter conditions. Equally, the narrative of mass famine or starvation as an inevitable consequence of the eruption oversimplifies the situation. While crop failures occurred across Europe and parts of Asia, their severity varied dramatically by region. Some areas experienced only minor yields, others saw near total collapse. The political upheavals that followed, particularly in Europe, where unrest grew amid food shortages, are often linked directly to climate failure, yet correlation does not imply causation. Economic hardship, war fatigue, and social inequality had long-standing roots independent of the eruption. There is also a persistent myth that Tambora alone caused the year without summer. In reality, volcanic activity was part of a broader climatic pattern. Cooler conditions in the early 19th century were already emerging due to other factors, including solar variability and oceanic circulation shifts. The eruption amplified existing instability, but did not initiate it. Moreover, while literature like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is often seen as a direct product of the dark skies and stormy weather that year, this interpretation risks romanticizing historical causality. Her story was shaped by personal circumstances, her journey to Switzerland in 1816, her conversations with Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley, and while atmospheric gloom may have influenced the mood of their discussions, it is impossible to say how deeply climate affected artistic creation. Finally, much of what we know comes from later interpretations. The idea that Tambora's eruption was a singular catastrophe has been reinforced by modern scientific consensus, but contemporaries did not perceive it as such. Many were unaware of its scale until years after the fact. In truth, our understanding is built on fragments, scattered records, post hoc analysis, and the slow accumulation of data across centuries. What remains uncertain is not just detail, but how much we can ever know about a world so far removed in time and memory. What endures is not just the memory of frost in June, but the quiet tremor it sent through centuries. The year, without a summer, did not vanish with a thaw. It settled into stories, tales whispered at hearths, where children were born under grey skies, where families traded land for bread and hope for survival. These moments lingered not because they were grand, but because they were ordinary, made extraordinary by suffering. In the years that followed, a kind of cultural recalibration took place, not through speeches or manifestos, but in the hush between words, in the way novels began to explore isolation, in the paintings where light seemed to struggle against the shadow. The absence of summer became a metaphor for loss and fragility, one that resonated across borders and classes. But more than art, it is the persistence of uncertainty that remains. We do not know how many perished, few records survived, even fewer were kept. We cannot say precisely how far the cold reached, or which hands first sowed seeds in soil still stiff with frost. The exact toll remains obscured by time and silence. Still, what endures is this: a reminder that the earth moves beneath us, not only through tectonic shift, but through quiet shifts of human life. How fragile balance can be when one force from afar alters the rhythm of seasons, and how quickly that disruption can unravel economies, displace people, fracture faith. We are still learning to name such turning points, not as disasters, but as moments where nature's indifference meets human resilience. And in that space between fear and endurance, there is a kind of dignity, not in conquering the cold, but in enduring it, still tending soil, still writing poems, still watching for light.